Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast. Hello everyone and welcome to the first episode in For Your Considerations 2019 October Fright Fest Spooktacular. Thank you so much for joining us. I am your host, Mike Josick.
And I'm your other host, Dustin Friesenan.
And for anybody who is familiar with the October Fright Fest Spooktacular, I guess we're all on the same page. For anybody who isn't familiar with it, basically every year Dustin and I like to pick kind of a Halloween theme, and then we take every week in October and we dive into that theme. Last year was Guillermo del Toro films. The year before that, I think, was foreign films in the American...
No, it was a horror series, long-standing horror series, the original and the remake. Or was that the first year?
I think that was the first year. And the year before Del Toro was the Japanese, or the foreign horror movie and the American remake.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, every year we pick kind of a concept and we go with it. So, this year, Dustin, what is the theme that we chose?
As we've mentioned on some prior episodes, this year's theme is a look at Universal monsters. The Monsterverse may have bombed, but we're going to look at what they were doing anyway. We're going to look at the original monsters and what's happened to them in more recent times.
The Universal monster films became popularized. I guess you can count Hunchback of Notre Dame, Phantom of the Opera, The Man Who Laughs. That was kind of like the 20s beginnings, but in the 30s, particularly with 1931's Dracula, the Todd Browning film, that kind of kicked this whole horror thing in the pants, and Carl Laemmle was producing films for Universal. I believe he actually started the Universal studio, and they had movies like Dracula, Frankenstein, The Invisible Man,
Creature from the Black Lagoon,
Wolfman. And because the Universal monsters are such an iconic thing, and because the Monsterverse was kind of an aborted shared universe...
everybody's trying to make one. And
was it last year or the year before? Was it 2017 or 2018 that the Monsterverse, that the Mummy came out?
We'll see in a few episodes when we do it. That's for sure.
We wanted to look at the original... Well, we were going to pick 4 original Universal monster films, and we were going to kind of look at what Universal has done with them since then. So our first effort is going to be the Dracula films, Dracula 1931 and Dracula Untold. Next week we're going to be doing the Wolfman and the Joe Johnston Wolfman remake with Benicio del Toro. And then we're going to do Frankenstein. And since there isn't a Universal remake for Frankenstein...
Since Abbott and Costello met Frankenstein.
we're actually going to... It's the one divergence we're going to make during this spooktacular. We're going to be doing the Victor Frankenstein film with James McAvoy and Daniel Radcliffe, and then we're going to be wrapping the whole series up with the original Mummy and the Tom Cruise Mummy.
So we'll be starting with the 2 films that we're going to start the Monsterverse, and we will end with the films that may have very well killed the Monsterverse.
That was entirely unplanned, but sounds fucking brilliant. And one of the reasons we wanted to talk about these two is just the Universal monsters are so iconic, and just being able to cover these movies is a fun thing. But Dustin and I both have opinions about the efforts that sort of came out with the Monsterverse that might be contrary to a lot of other people's opinions, and we thought that it was definitely worth, particularly like with the Mummy, we wanted to talk about the Mummy on the show at some point, either as an All Things Considered episode or a commentary or something, and I think it was part of those conversations that just sort of dovetailed with this, and we were like, man, let's just make it part of the Halloween thing. So
that's a theme we can do.
Yeah. So really looking forward to covering these movies this month.
As we said, we'll be starting off with Dracula and Dracula Untold, which itself is a bit of a slight divergence given that Dracula Untold is not a retelling of Dracula, whereas the other films will be much closer to that.
But the reason we chose Dracula Untold is because it was a film developed and produced by Universal with the intent of rebirthing the Universal monsters as a franchise. So
there were some discussions, but we fell on the Untold side.
It's definitely going to be the most divergent as far as comparing the two movies, but I don't think it's going to be a problem, really, to talk about these two movies sort of together. Now, the 1931 Dracula was directed by Todd Browning and starred the inimitable Bela Lugosi, David Manners, Helen Chandler, Dwight Fry, and Edward Van Sloan. It got a wide release on February 14th, 1931. And Dracula Untold was directed by Gary Shore. It starred Luke Evans, Dominic Cooper, Sarah Gaden, and Charles Dance. And it was released on October 10th, 2014. Dude, that's like literally 6 years. 6 years ago. We're recording this pretty much on the anniversary.
Also entirely unplanned.
Now, interestingly, Dracula Untold had a budget of $70 million and grossed like $217 million at the box office, which is probably why Universal was like, all right, let's take this into Marvel territory and create a shared universe. And it's really kind of shocking that they haven't continued with it.
Honestly, I'm a little shocked at those numbers because I don't really remember hearing much about Dracula Untold when it came out.
And to be fair, on Wikipedia, there was a note that Alex Kurtzman, who directed the Mummy remake, he has actually denied the claims that this film is canon with the Dark Universe. So even though a lot of people view this... My understanding was that they were going to reboot their Universal Monsters. And when they came up with the idea for the Dark Universe...
They wanted to make this film to test the waters, to see if there was interest in
No. The Dark Universe idea came after this film was successful. I think because there wasn't a lot of really hard information as to whether or not this folds in. People just assumed it probably did because it was a Dracula movie, and then there was going to be a Mummy movie, and then there was going to be an Invisible Man movie with Johnny Depp, and there was going to be Bride of Frankenstein. And I don't think there was like a Dracula remake in that first rollout for the Dark Universe, so it was just assumed. But I don't know if that's even solid. Although Kurtzman is one of the architects of the Dark Universe, I think.
And at the same time, they did have that tacked on post-credit stinger.
Which could just be that they planned a sequel.
True enough.
But anyways, it was Universal's most recent attempt to do something with the Dracula property. But let's start talking about the Lugosi Dracula, which
follows the same plot that everybody's generally familiar with. Dracula travels to America or to Britain or to wherever he's going, depending on which film you're talking about, tries to take Harker's girlfriend after taking his girlfriend's best friend. Van Helsing convinces everyone that Dracula may or may not be a vampire, and they take him out at the end in Carfax Abbey.
Which technically isn't the way... The Carfax Abbey thing, Dracula returns home to Transylvania in the book. But, I mean, it is pretty close to Stoker's book. Although, and this is something that I think we're going to touch on, and I think had a pronounced effect on how we reacted to this film, the budget for the film was fairly modest and didn't allow for a lot of the stuff that would have made it closer to the Stoker novels. So it ultimately followed more the stage play, which is something they follow through with on Frankenstein as well, if I'm not mistaken.
But we'll get to that when we get to that.
One of the things that I responded quite strongly to with this movie, I'm going to write out, just flat out say, I'm not a fan of this movie. It had been years since I had seen it, so I really wasn't sure how I was going to react to it. I remembered not liking it back in the day as a young lad, and I mean, it's got its iconic status. There's things about it that have, carried through our culture and are just sort of it's part of the Universal Monsters thing, and that's fine. But it's not one of my favorite Universal Monster movies, and part of that reason is Browning's a really boring director, and there's no music through the film. And
there's a lot of dead air.
Lots of long stretches of just people sitting there, not even saying anything.
Or Bela Lugosi just staring at you.
Which was okay in, White Zombie. We got a kick out of that.
In White Zombie, it worked. Didn't White Zombie have some sort of background track going on?
Yeah, it was a talkie.
Well, yeah, I mean, did it have a soundtrack? Did it have music?
That I honestly don't remember.
But here, you're having these one-sided conversations where Bela Lugosi is staring at Renfeld, and Renfeld's like, "No, master, I wasn't going to betray you. No, yes, I'll do it, I swear." And then he'll just cut to Bela Lugosi in between his sentences, and he's just staring for 5 solid seconds. It's if he's sending telepathic communications, do it as a voiceover. Have some sort of musical stinger. A lot of people give a lot of crap to when someone's doing something psychic and the screen shakes or you have going on. You know what? I've seen it without. It's pretty bad. You just have people staring at that point.
A score would have been really helpful, and I've done a little bit of digging, and I've yet to find a reason for why there isn't any music with this film.
Except for that it wasn't popular yet, I guess.
It would so help. I mean, yeah, I guess, well, I mean, King Kong was one of the first movies to have like a scene-specific score added to it, but they do use...
Usually classical music.
There's some music at the beginning and right at the end, but you really need something in between. And I'm willing to give it credit for, like, at the time, women fainted with Lugosi doing his thing and his powerful stare and his hand motions and stuff. And men were, like, terrified, and it had an effect on people. Horror was not something that was really done for general audiences, and this is one of the first movies that was really kind of pushing that. What it lacked in kind of gore, it supposedly made up in atmosphere, but it just feels very passionless and very theatrical.
There were some things that were great about it, in particular where you're talking about theatricalness. When Van Helsing gets Lugosi to look at the mirror and he just slaps it out of his hand, and the stare that he gives, I was like, that is phenomenal. Why can't we have that kind of energy and emotion in anything else anyone has done? Because otherwise, Van Helsing is just an exposition machine.
Oh, he drove me crazy, this movie.
He's just explaining everything for like a solid hour.
And so much of it takes place in like single locations. There's the castle, there's the hospital, and there's Carfax Abbey. I think that's it. And if anything needs to happen, it happens in one of those locations.
One of those three. Maybe a little bit in that Romanian town at first, which was a little odd because the Romanians were kind of racist against themselves. Oh no, we're a superstitious lot over here. And we're Irish all of a sudden.
The Romanian-Irish connection is very strong.
You know how it is. But no, they're talking about how they're superstitious and they're silly. While believing that superstition, they're not just warning him away. They're like, "Oh, you know us. We're dumb Eastern folk. We don't know them science newfangled thingies." It's like, who are you explaining this for?
You make an interesting point with the mirror, though, because one thing that I mentioned to you, and one thing that I discovered in my own kind of exploration of this film, is that simultaneous to making Universal's Dracula, there was a Mexican crew or a Spanish crew making the same movie. So during the day, Browning's crew would shoot on these sets. By the way, beautiful sets. For the most part, the production design and some of the cinematography is really quite spectacular.
I have a hard time faulting set design from early movies, really. They did great set design.
They put a lot of effort into a lot of the stuff.
They didn't have special effects, so it's where all the money went.
Exactly. And the Spanish version, the actors, I can't remember what the director's name for that, but the Spanish director and the Spanish actors would come on at night and shoot on the same sets. And I really want to watch this movie because it apparently has a lot more energy to it. And like one of the things that bothered me about the Lugosi scene with the mirror was that you have Van Helsing show him the mirror, he slaps it out of his hands, and he's like, wah! Whereas in the Spanish version, he shows it to the Dracula in that scene, and it shows the mirror with no reflection in it, in a cut. And then it cuts back to the master shot, and he slaps it out of his hands. And I was wondering why that shot wasn't in the Browning version. Like, there's so many things, like, insert-wise, that shocked me that Browning didn't do.
I didn't mind that we didn't see the reason, because you knew that it was going to get explained by Professor Exposition. The thing that bothered me about
Professor Van Exposition.
Professor Van Exposition. The thing that bothered me about it was that was the point when I realized Dracula didn't give a shit. Because he said, after being asked, what happened? What did you see? Why did you react like that? He said, "Oh, just ask Van Helsing. He'll explain to you why I didn't like the mirror." And then he walks away. And it's like, you're not going to come up with a cover story? You're just going to let him say exactly what you are? All right, that's a little cocky. Okay, sure. But that cockiness carries on to an extreme, in particular at the end, which I abhorred. Because they're at Carfax Abbey. He just took the girlfriend and is carrying her up the stairs. He kills off Renfield in front of Van Helsing and Harker.
What a terrible, terrible roll down the stairs, by the way.
Terrible roll down the stairs.
Comically so.
But then he goes to bed, and it's like, so you lock the door and you just hope they're not going to go in there? Van Helsing specifically said he will tear down the entire abbey stone by stone around you to save her. And not save her life, save her soul. He specifically states a few times, you can't save her life, but you can save her soul. So they're like, we got to kill her.
If she dies during the daytime, she goes to heaven. If she dies at night, her soul is damned. And Dracula even says, like, I'll make sure she dies at night. Blah,
blah, blah. 1, 2, 3, ha ha. He goes to bed, and that's it. I expected him to wake up a little bit, for there to be some sort of something. But no, they're looking around noisily for some sort of thing to stick through his chest. Harker gets distracted and basically drops this iron rod right beside the slumbering Lugosi. And it's like, did you wake him up? Nope, guess not. I kind of figured when the scream happened off camera that maybe Dracula got the best of Van Helsing and now they have to go out into the sunlight and the sun kills him.
But that was the staking of Dracula.
But that was the staking of Dracula. Dracula's dead. And Mina, all of a sudden, is good to go. She's like, oh, I couldn't hear you. I could hear you, but I couldn't react. Okay, well, let's go home. You coming with us, Van Helsing? No, I'll be a minute. Roll credits. What?
You finished watching this movie before I did, and you were texting me like, WTF with this ending. And it'd been so long since I'd watched it that I forgot how abrupt it was. It literally just stops. It's like they ran out of film or something.
Like I could see so many other things happening. If Van Helsing were to say, no, I'll just be a minute, goes back, Dracula's there, and had gotten him, and now he's a vampire, and is suddenly turned, or has become a ghoul, and is following him like Renfield, that would be a reason for him to stick back. I'm thinking, why are you sticking around in this abbey? Dracula's dead. You've been up all night. Why not take the wounded, sick person home, who you said for the last hour has to be killed? You never said you could save her life. You were always talking about saving her soul. Why is she allowed to live now all of a sudden? It made no sense to me. It was just ridiculous.
One really interesting thing that I ran across in my exploration of the side bits of this film, as well as the Spanish version, at the time, not every theater was wired for sound. So this film actually went out and played in some theaters without sound. And this kind of fascinated me because when I found this out, it was kind of a eureka moment. Because when I was watching it, there's so much silence in this film, I wondered, would this play better as a silent film? It has some of that sort of German expressionism sort of in it, with some of the slow dolly moves and the lighting, and
it would have worked better as a silent film. But even silent films have music playing in the background, many of them.
And they show a scene, the first scene where Renfield meets Dracula at the castle. They show it as it would have been presented as a silent film. It works better with the dialogue cards coming up. And that was like a startling moment for me where I preferred this movie without sound. So there's a silent film version of this movie and a Spanish language version of this movie that
Both
are superior
of which seem to be better, yeah.
to this movie. And it seems like most critics will agree. I was feeling it's that moment where you're ready to like shit on a movie that's considered so iconic and so classic, even though you're recognizing things about it that are genuinely good, but overall you're like, man, this just doesn't work for me. And you wonder, is it something wrong with me? Like, am I just not connecting? Am I, illiterate in cinema, or what the hell's going on? But I've run across quite a few reviews of people who very much have the same opinion of this movie as we do, which then has me wondering, like, why it has this reputation and why there are people who still love it quite so much. And I would honestly love to have a conversation with somebody who loves this movie, because
why? I'd like to see some of the other ones. I'd like to see the Spanish version. I'd like to see Nosferatu in particular.
The original or the Herzog?
The Herzog. The German, the first one, the one that...
The Murnau movie.
The one that got them sued.
Actually, that might be fun. It might be fun to watch the Murnau Nosferatu and then watch the Herzog Nosferatu with Kinski, just for shits and giggles. Like, let's do that sometime soon.
Something to dread, hearing more about Dracula. But I'm more interested in those. My dad gave me like 30 or 50 classic horror movies in a DVD collection a good decade ago. And I haven't seen all of them, but I've seen a good half or so. I'm aware of the pacing of old school horror. I know how differently it works. So I'm very forgiving of a lot of things, but there are some unforgivable plot related things that just drive me nuts. In particular, that ending. Because writing existed for thousands of years, you can't use that as an excuse. Oh, it was an early film. Yeah, well, it's based on a novel. The novel had a better ending. Go away. You shut up now. I've seen movies from that era that have much better endings. Metropolis was a decade or two before that. It was much better and was better. You know, there's old films that are very good. This was not one of them.
Now, flash forward almost 90 years, and you get Universal taking another stab, taking another bite out of the Dracula legend. They hadn't actually made a Dracula movie in many, many years. And when they did decide to revisit it, they revisited it in 2016 with Dracula Untold. And instead of going back and just readapting the novel, and I wonder almost if they did this specifically to avoid comparisons with Coppola's Dracula, which is much beloved, they decided to sort of tell the origin of Vlad the Impaler, and they go back to, what is it, like 16th century, 17th century, and 15th century. It was like 1482 or something like that. And they're in Transylvania, and it's dealing with
the Turkish Empire invading them and using kids as slave military forces. And essentially, Vlad tries to avoid that happening to his own son and starts a war with a foe that he can't beat. So in order to win, he becomes a vampire.
And I was really curious about this movie because I'd heard some good things about it, and I was really eager to tackle this material from a different angle. I think it succeeded in some ways and didn't quite succeed in some others. What were your feelings going into this movie?
I've seen this story a number of times recently because pretty much ever since Castlevania Symphony of the Night, they've told a lot more of Dracula's youth and of making him into a tragic character as opposed to just a bloodthirsty villain. So I'm used to the idea of he had this wife who was generally killed by others, and he would have been a good vampire otherwise, doing his best to curb his appetites, but at this point he's like, you know what, fuck humanity. So it didn't go quite that route. He always maintained his humanity, so he went far more anti-hero than in some of the games or the anime adaptations that have been recent. But I enjoyed the overall story. I enjoyed what they did with it. There's some things that I really wonder about. For example, you have Charles Dance as the essentially the master vampire, and when he's freed, he does nothing. In the stinger, which apparently wasn't there the first go-around, he just basically says, well, here we go again, or, well, time to get started, or whatever. And it's like, time to... What? What are you doing here? Why is anything happening the way it is?
I will add there that when Vlad goes to talk to Charles Dance's master vampire and say, hey, can I have your powers for a bit? He explains that he'd been trapped in there until he could pass on his curse. And if he was able to pass on his curse, he would then go and exact vengeance on the person who trapped him there. So when he does eventually get freed from the cave, I was always under the assumption that he was like, all right, so I'm going to go and get my revenge. And then when you see him in the epilogue, my understanding of that was probably a sequel would have been Dracula in the 20th century, Charles Dance showing up and saying, hey, guess what? I've finally tracked down the guy who trapped me in the cave, and you're going to help me or I'm going to kill Mina.
Because we're going to kill this demon together.
And that's what I figured the next movie would be. So the whole Charles Dance thing, I mean, Charles Dance is one of the wonderful things in this movie. Charles Dance is the most wonderful thing in almost any movie. He's just great.
Though I do question his actions. Because if you're trying to pass your curse on to a lot of people, maybe don't kill everybody who goes into your cave. Maybe. Kill 4 of them and feed, because I know you're really thirsty.
He said the thirst is insatiable.
But then be like, okay, you're the only one alive. Here's the deal.
That is kind of funny when you think about it, because... Or maybe you have to want it? Because Vlad does ask the people at the Abbey that got almost killed, they're on the verge of dying, he asks if they want vengeance. Maybe he's just thinking, I don't want to curse you with this if you don't want it. But maybe they have to concede to it. Otherwise it won't work. Which is never clarified. But
I feel that the way Vlad was being played and written, he just didn't want to curse them without their permission, period. I don't see why you wouldn't be able to do so, because it's a simple matter of, here's my blood, now I kill you. And certainly that was never, ever a plot point in pretty much any vampire story I've ever seen.
So you feel the Master Vampire could have incapacitated anyone who came into his cave, made them drink his blood, and been like, ha! My curse is lifted, I've passed it on.
And that's where I wonder. Granted, they didn't give that much information, and it would make perfect sense they would have to be a willing person, to an extent. Anyway.
I never thought about that, but I do agree with you that is kind of a gray area. I will grant you that. And I do agree with you that it is a fun movie. Like, it's an adventure movie. This is not a horror film. It is way more in line with what Kurtzman was doing with Tom Cruise's Mummy. It has horror elements to it. And, I mean, there's definitely some gore, but it's a PG-13 movie. It is a fantasy adventure. It's a dark fantasy adventure. That's really what it is. And that's also part of why I was looking forward to it, because, like I said, it was a different angle. But I do think that PG-13 hurt them.
I feel it hurts pretty much anything that wants to call itself a horror.
And I do feel that, and I mean, this could just be me, but having all the Transylvanians... Okay, I'll grant you, Luke Evans, I did dig him in the role. And he did give me like a strong vampire vibe. And there is something sort of ethnically kind of different about his look. And I buy him in the role. But everybody else looked like they just walked off a Robin Hood movie. And Dominic Cooper as his antagonist, as his enemy, playing a Turk. Like, I don't know. There were some things as far as...
Speaking of the
whitewashing that were kind of like bothering me a little bit.
The Turks were just ridiculous. But at the same time, I was very torn, because when you are that group that's in power and uses force and your massive empire to hold on to that power, that kind of absurd violence and, oh, you deny me one thing, so I'm going to kill you all, is how you do it. Yet at the same time, it almost feels like it's a bit too much. Because like they were raised together. It's like, well, you guys are so close.
I also would have felt better about it if... Because at first I was like, wow, they're playing the Turks really gross. And then, I've seen them play the British really gross. Any kind of like occupying colonial force is gross.
I was reading some poetry from an 18th or 19th century colonial force. It's pretty gross.
You watch Braveheart and the British are played pretty gross. Like, it's... Whoever the bad guy is, you got to play them kind of gross. But it sort of twigged me a little bit because the Transylvanians were so white. And I could just be being a little bit extra sensitive about this. But it just... I don't know. It resonated poorly with me. Even though I could still get through the movie, it just... I don't know. There was like I didn't feel this in the Coppola movie, and maybe it was because there wasn't an opposing force with a darker skin color. It was mostly just about Vlad having his things going on, his beloved wife dying, and him forsaking God and living forever and finding Mina hundreds of years later and having that whole thing go on. So I don't get that weird racial vibe off of Coppola's Dracula, or the Browning Dracula, or like so many Draculas in between, but something about this one just rubbed me the wrong way.
The big, vaguely ethnic. I've gotten, it's really bad to say, but I've gotten so used to whitewashing that I buy into whatever they're saying. They're like, You're Transylvanians? All right. You're Turkish? All right. Transylvanians, Turks, skin color don't matter.
And I'm usually fine with the, whatever foreign nationality it is, they're speaking British, and that denotes they're foreign.
And evil, for that matter.
It's often evil, yeah. If there's some sort of, internal consistency that isn't blatantly, awkwardly a little bit racist, I'm generally okay with it because because it's consistent and because it's creating a. I understand why they do it. I understand the casting practice there.
But ignoring the casting a little bit, you look at the story. You've got somebody who's Vlad the Impaler. We all acknowledge that he's somebody who's made forests of people by sticking friggin' tree stumps through their anuses. You've got to make this guy the good guy somehow. You've got to make him sympathetic. So yeah, the other side is going to be pretty plainly bad.
They do qualify.
Thus, the child slaves. They qualify,
he was created.
They qualify that, sure, but...
And he didn't want to continue that way.
But he also had to bring old Vlad back in order to face off against the Turkish armies and slaughter them down. And of course, then when the other Transylvanians, who are newly vampires, at the very end there, they're like, all right, well, now we can kill your son because we don't really need him. We've got a new group of people here. We're your people, so you're our king, protect us. He's like, no. Kills them all and tries to kill himself. I would love if that was the ending, where that crazy guy comes up, pours some blood into his mouth, and you're just left with that open ending. Because that guy coming back for that specific scene would make perfect sense. I would have loved that.
And that was the ending for a while, but Universal wanted the epilogue.
Which means we can blame Marvel for that, because they're the ones who started all this post-credit stinger bullshit.
Well, it wasn't even post-credits. It was actually pre-credits. It was the end of the movie, but...
Post-story stingers and trailers and teasers. Can we just have a story that ends?
I genuinely didn't mind the Dracula in the present and seeing Sarah Gaden again playing Mina. I did think it was awkwardly done.
It would have been a bit less awkward if Charles Dance wasn't there. Because then at least you would just be saying, okay...
The story continues.
The story continues. It's going to be a modern retelling of...
Dracula.
Of Stoker's Dracula. Yeah. And all would be fine and dandy. And
which is how I took it until they showed...
Until Charles Dance comes in and it's like, what the hell are you doing here? Who are you? In fact, where were you before during the whole battle? I was expecting you to fly in.
Which is funny because I don't usually question Charles Dance's presence. I'm usually pleased to have him there. But yeah.
I feel that sometimes you do question his presence because we were watching Silent Hill last night and you were there just shouting out, "Where's Charles Dance?" I want him to just walk in off stage left, tip a hat, and just go. Somewhere in the movie.
He's one of the best things in Godzilla King of Monsters. I mean, he's one of the best things whenever he's in it. Anyways.
Just every single film he should be added in.
I love the production design. I loved a lot of the cinematography. There's some really great set pieces and there's some beautiful imagery in this movie. I'm not really familiar with the work of Gary Shore. I think he's made one or two other horror movies or something. It was competently done. I didn't think it had a very strong visual flair to it. In a lot of ways, I think this movie has a lot of potential. I do genuinely like it more than the 31 Dracula, possibly because it's just playing with a lot more contemporary conventions. But it fails, I think, to reach that potential, which just makes it kind of tragic to me, because it would have been cool to just have a new kind of take on Dracula. And I thought Luke Evans was doing a really good job with the role, and I wish it was a little darker, because you need a little extra dark to sort of shine in the light. It's like an hour and a half, too. It's a short fucking movie.
But it was a fun movie, and I think that's its strongest point. I would actually watch it again. I feel it would be worth a rewatch for funsies.
The fact that it is an hour and a half, it is such a minimal time investment. That does partially make it fun and rewatchable.
Whereas you talk about the 1931, that might go in the museum for being the first Dracula, if we want to ignore Nosferatu, but it doesn't live up. It's not. We might just be jaded these days, but It's not scary. The lack of the music hurts it so much. And that abrupt ending out of nowhere kills it for me. Just utterly destroys it. Whereas Dracula Untold, it's a full story. The things people do make sense to me. I can get behind people's motivations. I can get behind their actions. I can get behind that movie for its flaws. In spite of its flaws, I can get behind that movie.
I agree. I feel I may revisit Browning's Dracula down the line, but I'm in no hurry.
I'd revisit alternate versions of it.
Exactly. It's definitely one of those movies from an analytical level I would revisit in some way, but for enjoyment, no. And there are films from this period that I genuinely enjoy. Like, we've been criticized in the forums and on YouTube in the comment sections for, oh, you guys just don't get, old movies or how movies, were made back then, or you're not giving any credence to the fact that times were different and things affected people differently. We do. We genuinely do. And there's, like I said, movies from this period that have affected us deeply, that we love dearly.
Metropolis is excellent. M is excellent. The Last Man on Earth, I enjoyed very much so. Frankenstein, which we'll be getting to, spoiler alert, I enjoyed a fair bit. I haven't seen it in 20 years, and I'm hoping that I still enjoy it as much as I did then, but I have a lot to say off of those memories of this film I haven't seen since I was 9 years old, staying up until 1 a.m. waiting for my dad to come home from out of town.
So we get it. Like, we definitely know about the period that this came out in and the effect that it had on people. And we understand why it is iconic, but we just don't think it stands up. At least not as a whole. There are things about it that stand up. And it's definitely influenced the culture, and it's influenced every interpretation of Dracula since. But as a movie...
But that makes it a part of history. That's something that goes in a museum. And if you're interested in learning about history, sure, you can watch it. But you're not going to sit down and say, I feel like a good scare. Let's pop in 1931's Dracula.
And I would definitely revisit Dracula Untold at the very least for a commentary viewing. There is a commentary with Gary Shore and either a producer or the cast or something. And I am curious. I am curious to do that because I do love commentaries. So I may even have a slightly different opinion of the film after that. If I was rating them like out of 5 stars, I would give Dracula 1931, Browning's Dracula, like 2 stars. And I would give Dracula Untold 3.
I'd give 2 and possibly even 4. Fun movie, worth rewatching.
That's fair.
Maybe 3.5.
I would almost prefer Dracula Untold with a sequel. I kind of feel they sort of give it the superhero movie structure, and they treat it very much like a superhero movie.
Did he do the superhero landing at any point?
He might have. He reappears with the bats, so he doesn't have to do like the boom.
He doesn't have to.
He does punch the floor when he's manipulating the bats as his fist. But because this movie has a very superhero structure to it and feel to it, I don't feel bad at all comparing it to like some of the DC movies that were a little bit problematic or whatever. Some of those movies I would prefer more having seen the story continue the way it was supposed to. And I kind of feel like in retrospect, same with the Alien films actually, these movies, these series where if you let the filmmakers finish the story they're telling and then judge the whole thing rather than judging the individual chapters, because this is the way storytelling seems to be going in a lot of films now. Let me see all of Ridley Scott's Alien movies, then tell me that they're shit. Let me see, the trilogy of Dracula movies that they wanted to make.
Let me see what happens with Superman and Batman instead of giving it to another director who now has to change it. Same thing happens with Star Wars, where now it's a new director who's not using some of the plot points set up. It's cherry-picking plot threads within a story. You're told, leave some stuff open, and then others don't touch that, and it makes it for very problematic. It's a partial story that's left with big Swiss cheese holes later on.
And I thought Untold was a perfectly serviceable film. I got excited by the prospect of what would like a modern retelling of Stoker's Dracula with this cast be, and getting away from some of the problematic
or a futuristic
Turkish Transylvanian whatever, or futuristic, yeah,
a futuristic one like Dracula 3000.
But to give it
classic,
to give it a sense of continuity and context, I think could even improve this movie and make me more fond of it than I am. Just kind of like thinking in a hindsight is 2020 sort of way or something. I don't know.
Either way, that's what we thought of Dracula and Dracula Untold, and we invite you to tell us how wrong we were in the comment sections, as you can never please everyone, so...
And in this case, I don't think we're going to please anyone. Yeah, feel free to hit us up on our social media. We are available on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just search at FYC Show or For Your Consideration. We're the guys with the big FYC logo. We'd love to hear what your thoughts are. And if you enjoyed this conversation and what we do on the show, feel free to like and share us on your social media. Spread the word. Word of mouth is the best way to spread the love, I guess. If you want to support us in a more robust way, we also have a Patreon account. You can check us out there, or patreon.com/FYC show. We got some reward levels, and just kind of, helps fund technical aspects of the show, servers, that kind of stuff, helps keep the lights on. And another way to support the show is when you stream or download off of iTunes while you're there. Just rate and review the show. 5 stars obviously is the best. It really does help with getting the show into the eyes and ears of folks who may be interested in this content and just have no way of finding it. Although I think we have actually been a lot more prominent on iTunes lately, so I think whatever people have been doing has been working somewhat. So thanks everybody for what's been going on there. The algorithms are working in our favor, finally, after 3 years.
It all takes time. And next time, we should be looking at The Wolfman and the Wolfman.
We got a full moon next week, so I declared to Dustin we are doing The Wolfman. Yeah, I actually have recent memories of both films, so I'm curious to go back, see if that changes.
And I haven't seen either of them, so it'll be all new to me.
Interesting. Very cool. So, thanks again for joining us for first episode of our October Fright Fest Spooktacular. Be sure to join us next week when we do The Wolfman, as Dustin said. And until then, I've been your spooky host, Mike.
And I've been your frightening host, Dustin. Or your tacular. If you're the spooky, I'm the tacular. I'm the tacky one. I'll take that.
We'll see you next time on For Your Consideration. Take care.
Bye-bye. You need more sleep, man.